At 70 years old, you don't really expect big surprises anymore. At most, that the doctor was wrong about your cholesterol, or that your grandson remembers to call you on your birthday. But that Monday, at 9:30 in the morning, I walked into a stranger's house to buy a cheap lamp and walked out with something much more expensive. The uncomfortable feeling that my whole life might be a lie. It was Monday, yes, and there was that silly kind of sunlight sneaking in through the blinds telling you, "Come on, woman, you're not museum material yet." I'd gotten up early, watered the plants, argued with the coffee machine, which works only when it feels like it, and while I was taking my second sip, I heard the buzzer at the building door and my neighbor's voice announcing that in the house on the corner, number 12, they were having a garage sale. If anyone wanted to stop by, there was a bit of everything. I'm not stupid. A bit of everything is a magic phrase after a certain age. So I closed my front door, shoved the keys into my bag, checked the time 9:30 on the dot, and headed to number 12. Thinking about something very modest. A floor lamp for the living room, something that didn't look like it had been pulled from a 70s horror movie. The house smelled of old dust and cheap perfume, the kind visitors put on to look elegant. The door was open, and inside there was a small, organized chaos. Tables with mismatched tablecloths covered in plates, picture frames, porcelain figurines that were downright creepy, boxes half-filled with folded clothes, books stacked in dangerous piles. In the back, a badly tuned radio was playing, and light slanted in through a big window, catching the dust motes and making them look like slow snow. Come in, have a look at whatever you like," a woman's voice said from the hallway. I didn't see her. I only heard her shuffling steps, and that way of speaking of someone who's tired, but not defeated. Out of habit, I nodded to the air and slipped between the tables with that mix of curiosity and guilt you get when you're looking through other people's things, as if you were snooping through their lives at €2 a kilo. First, I saw the cups, all with flowers. Then the books, lots of medical ones, from when people had time to read serious things. Then I reached a low box full of picture frames, all jumbled together as if memory had fallen to the floor and someone had picked it up in a hurry. I bent down a little, because at this age, the world down there is a foreign country, and started rummaging through frames. Strangers' weddings, kids I didn't know, first communions with impossible hairstyles, beach landscapes. None of it was mine, of course, until I saw that photo. It was a small, matte photo, the paper already yellowed. A baby wrapped in a white blanket, the blurry background of what looked like a hospital, an incubator, or an old metal crib. I picked it up because babies always stir something tender in me, even when they cry, even when they spit up, even when they grow up and forget to call you. I brought it closer to my face, with that patience that comes with tired eyes, and I felt a little whip in my stomach, a strange feeling, like déjà vu mixed with vertigo. What eyes, I thought. Those half-closed eyes, that odd shape of the eyebrows, that nose. What nonsense, I told myself, as if you could recognize yourself as a baby. I turned the frame over to see if it said the year, the name of the child, something, anything. And that was when the floor shifted a little under my feet. On the back, in an old, elegant handwriting, that fine script nobody teaches anymore, it said, "I've been looking for you since 1963. Nothing else. No name, no I love you, no your mother, no your sister, nothing. Just, I've been looking for you since 1963. And me, who's always been more of a laugher than a crier, did the only thing I could think of in that moment. I snorted. "Oh, come on," I muttered, another drama queen loose in the world. I did feel a little shiver, yes, but I covered it with irony, which is the blanket that's kept me warm all my life. Even so, I stuck my hand back into the box, looking for more photos, some clue, a last name, a date. But all I found were empty frames, cut-off portraits where someone was missing, couples smiling too much. "Do you like anything?" The voice from before sounded much closer. I turned around, and there she was. An older woman, more or less my age, maybe a couple of years more, with white hair pulled back in a high ponytail, sweatpants and a blouse that had once been elegant, light eyes, very light, the kind that look at you like they're stripping your excuses. She was watching me, not the box, not the photo me, as if she'd known me before. I was looking at these photos, I said, because I always say something when I feel watched, even if it's stupid. Poor things, right? Nobody wants them. She didn't look at the photo. She kept staring at me. That's not true, she answered, very softly. I've spent my whole life wanting one of them. Her sentence threw me off, but I kept going with my own, because when a suspicion starts brushing against your skin, the first thing you do is talk about any nonsense, so you don't have to listen to it. And how much is this one? I asked, lifting the photo of the baby. This time she did look at the picture, and she froze. I saw her jaw tense, her eyes fill with tears that didn't fall, her fingers digging into the edge of the table to stop herself from doing something ridiculous, like fainting or running away. It's you, she whispered. Sorry? It's you, she repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling. It's you. And there, I admit, I got angry. When a 70-year-old woman looks at you like you're either the Virgin Mary appearing or the gas bill, one of the two, your body goes straight into defense mode. Look, ma'am, I came for a lamp, I said, holding up the photo like a weapon. I'm not here to join a cult. She took a step toward me, slow, almost dragging her feet, and stopped right in front of me, so close I could smell her cheap perfume, that mix of flowers and alcohol that always reminds me of funerals. She looked me over from head to toe, without bothering to hide it, searching my face, my neck, my hands. It's you, she insisted, and this time her voice came out broken. I've been looking for you my whole life. I felt the hairs stand up on my arms, but I kept my face still, the same face I put on when the doctor says, "This won't hurt," and I know it's a lie. Me? I asked, sarcastic. Well, you're late, because I've spent my whole life finding myself alone. She didn't laugh. Not at all. Not even a smirk. Your name used to be something else, she said, almost in a whisper. But they changed your name. And your life. At that moment, a part of me wanted to bolt out of that house, run back to my sofa, my plants, my cold coffee, my normal problems, the kind that fit into a little blood pressure pill. Another part, much smaller but more stubborn, stayed rooted there, with the photo in my hand and my head full of a strange buzzing. Before we go on, I'm going to tell you something, because it amuses me to imagine you there, with your headphones, your phone, or whatever you use to listen to an old woman coming apart while she tells you her life. Before I continue with my story, I'm really curious to know where in the world and at what time you're tuning in today. I'd love to read you in the comments. I'm here talking to you from some random Monday, mid-morning, and you, who knows, maybe you're in your pajamas or on the subway. Funny, isn't it? Life crossing timelines like the corridors of this house. Let's get back to it. Look at yourself properly, the woman insisted. Look at that scar here, and she pointed behind my left ear. You got it when you fell out of the crib the night that... I pulled back a little, instinctively, taking my hand to my ear. The scar was there, of course. It had always been there. A doctor once said it must be from some childhood bump. I never gave it any importance. Life is full of little marks. You don't know anything about me, I said, more serious now. Not my name, not who I am, not where I've lived. Your name is Grace, she answered, without hesitating. Grace, although that's not what you were called before. She looked at me with so much sadness that for a second I saw myself reflected in her, like I was staring into a slightly warped mirror from the future. And who are you? I asked, finally. She swallowed, straightened up a bit, as if that gesture mattered. I'm Helen, she said. Helen Marquez. The last name hit my memory in a strange way. It was like hearing a song you don't remember but your body hums along anyway. Nice to meet you, Helen Marquez, I replied, holding out my hand more out of reflex than politeness. I'm Grace. She took my hand, but instead of letting go, she squeezed it hard. I've been looking for you since 1963, Grace, she whispered. Since the day they tore you from my arms in the hospital. That was too much. Too big, too melodramatic, too late. I felt a mix of anger and laughter rise up my throat, like I was about to burst out laughing or start swearing. Look, I said, pulling my hand back. I was born in 53, more or less. That's what my ID says. I never bothered to ask the exact day because nobody cares at this age, but I definitely wasn't torn from anywhere. My parents were normal people. Church on Sundays, soup on Mondays, not the type to go around stealing babies from hospitals. Helen shook her head slowly. Your parents, she said, dragging out the words. The ones who raised you, not the ones who made you. I looked at her with the same expression I use on telemarketers when they try to sell me fiber optic internet, a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. And why would anyone want to steal me, Helen? I asked, ironic. I'm not an heir to a king or a famous singer's daughter. I'm a woman who gets up 3 times a night to pee. She smiled for the first time, a small, tired, but genuine smile. I don't know, she admitted. I only know I had a baby sister, a twin, and one day they took her away. They told me she had died. But I saw her breathe. I saw her cry. I felt her. And since then, she pointed to the photo, I've been looking for her everywhere. I felt my throat tighten a little, but I stayed standing, steady. All right, I said, trying to sound practical. Let's suppose, just for a moment, that this isn't the bad script of a soap opera. What do you want from me? I want to know if it's you, she replied, if you're my sister. The word sister fell on me like a wet blanket. I'd spent 70 years as an only child, used to quiet hallways, small Christmases, never sharing a room or clothes or blame. And suddenly, I had a stranger in front of me calling me sister, as if that title could just be handed out like that on a Monday morning, along with a second-hand lamp. I'm not your anything, I said, drier than I meant to. Not your sister, not your friend, not your media case. Helen didn't get offended. She looked at me with a tenderness that irritated me deeply. I know, she said. For now. She offered me a chair. I didn't sit. Listen, Helen. I took a deep breath. I don't know what story you're carrying around, or how much truth or loneliness there is in all this, but I'm not interested, okay? I'm old, yes, but not dumb. I know there are people who invent relatives to ask for money, to get on TV, to fill their emptiness. My emptinesses I deal with myself. I don't know if it was my words or my tone, but I saw her press her lips together to stop a sob from escaping. She leaned on the table, looked at the photo of the baby, and stroked it with her fingertip, with a gentleness that stirred something inside me. I don't want your money, she said. I just want the truth. The word truth stayed floating between us, heavy, uncomfortable. I did what I do best when things overwhelm me. I turned around. Keep your truth, ma'am, I snapped. I'm leaving with my lamp, if I can find one that won't give me nightmares. I dropped the photo on the table, almost angrily, as if it were to blame for something, and walked out into the hallway with quick steps, not looking back. I crossed the entrance, jumped down the 2 front steps almost in one go, and when the outside air hit my face, I took a deep breath, like someone stepping out of a smoke-filled room. It was 10:15 when I checked my watch again. I'd been in there less than an hour, but my body felt as heavy as if years had passed. I leaned for a moment against the wall of the building across the street, felt the sun on my face, heard a car drive by, the murmur of 2 women talking about supermarket deals, and I thought the world was carrying on, oblivious to the phrase still buzzing in my head. I've been looking for you since 1963. I walked back home slowly, more because I needed to sort my thoughts than for my knees' sake. I opened the front door to my building, took the elevator, and counted the floors under my breath, like I used to do as a girl so I wouldn't think about other things. And when I went into my flat, the first thing I did wasn't put on the kettle, or sit down, or complain about my hip. The first thing I did was go straight to the hallway cupboard, bend down back, to that foreign country of the floor, and pull out the tin box where I keep all the photos of my life. I set it on the dining room table, the tablecloth still wrinkled from breakfast, and lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and stored-away memories hit my nose, that mix of dust and past that has always seemed sad and sweet at the same time. I started pulling out photos. Me at 6 on the beach with a red bucket, me in my school uniform, serious, hair messy, me at my first communion, in a dress that looked like whipped cream. My parents young, my mother in a checkered blouse, my father with a cigarette in his hand, me as a teenager in flared trousers that would be vintage now and were ridiculous then, me on my wedding day, me pregnant, me with my daughter in my arms, me growing old on paper. I laid them out on the table, sorting them by decade, by hairstyle, by type of smile, and suddenly I realized something. Something was missing. A whole stretch of film was missing. There, it wasn't a single photo of me as a baby. Not one. No me in a crib. No me in my mother's arms just born. No me with barely any hair. Eyes swollen, wrinkled skin from just arriving. Nothing. The first photo I appear in, I'm already a little girl of 2 or 3, in a striped dress, in a park, with a yellow ball at my feet. Before that, nothing. Like I just appeared in the world out of nowhere, already walking, already talking, already knowing that things can be lost. I looked at the table full of pictures, looked at the empty box, looked at the window where the morning light was now higher, and I put my hand over my chest, not because it hurt, but because something inside had shifted. It was 11:15 the last time I checked the clock. The ticking sounded loud in the silent kitchen. And there, with the photos scattered like an incomplete jigsaw puzzle, I admitted it out loud, just for myself. Something doesn't add up, Grace. For the first time since I walked out of that house, I wondered whether the stranger from number 12 was crazy, or if the crazy one had been me, for not asking questions for 70 years. I didn't sleep. Or I slept in fits, with my eyes half open, like old cats do when they want to seem relaxed. The clock hit 2, 3, 4, and my head was still full of photos, names, and that ridiculous phrase written on the back of the paper. I've been looking for you since 1963. At 7 in the morning, I decided insomnia doesn't go away by counting sheep, but by counting answers. I made coffee bad, as always, and sat in front of the open photo box I'd left on the table, as if the pictures might line up by themselves overnight and tell me the truth. They didn't, of course. Photos don't talk, they just stare. I thought about Helen, about her voice, about how she looked at me, about the certainty with which she said, "It's you." And I also thought about the possibility, however small, that this woman wasn't as crazy as she seemed. Then I laughed to myself, with that acidic humor I use when reality gets too serious for me. Twins, stolen babies, me, the main character of some Argentinian Sunday afternoon film? No, thanks. And yet, the lack of photos from my early childhood was still there, like a constant drip inside my skull. The hours went by without me doing much. I watered the plants twice, opened and closed the same drawer 3 times, and even caught myself talking to the ficus as if it were a confessor. At 7 in the evening, I decided that if I didn't go back, my curiosity would end up coming to get me. So I got changed, put on my red coat, the one that makes me look braver than I am, and walked back down to number 12. The air smelled of freshly baked bread from the corner bakery, and the streetlights were just starting to come on, that time of day that's neither evening nor night, when everything feels suspended. I walked slowly, more to hide it than out of caution, and, when I reached the house, the door was ajar, as if they'd been expecting me. Helen saw me walk in, and didn't look surprised. She was sitting at the same table, with a steaming cup of tea and a brown envelope in front of her. She had the look of someone who has rehearsed this meeting many times. "I knew you'd come back," she said, without getting up. "Don't get ahead of yourself," I answered, dropping into the chair across from her. "I didn't come for you. I came for my curiosity." Helen smiled, just a little. She opened the envelope and pulled out a handful of yellowed papers, copies of records, newspaper clippings, black and white photos. She spread them on the table with almost religious care. "This is everything I know," she said, "and what I believe." I picked up the first sheet, a birth certificate, St. Anne's Hospital, London, 1963. Date: November 4. Mother, unknown. Baby, female. No name, notes. Twin, a deceased at birth. Twin B transferred to incubator. I felt my palms start to sweat, so I hid them under the table. "And what does this have to do with me?" I asked, trying to sound bored. Helen looked up and pointed to the margin of the paper, where someone had written in blue pen, "Marquez, my last name," she said. I sighed. In my head, the usual phrase was forming. This is nonsense, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. I looked at the rest of the papers. There were photos of an orphanage, clippings about adoptions, a 1978 article on irregularities in Catholic hospitals, and an old photo with a priest in the middle and several babies in nurses' arms. In the background, a woman barely visible, whose face seemed vaguely familiar, maybe because all faces from the past look alike. "Look, Helen," I said at last, "let's suppose this is all true. Let's suppose that at some point someone decided to give me to a different family. What does that change? 70 years later, so what? I can't put myself back in the crib." Helen watched me with a mixture of sadness and patience, the way you look at someone who's not ready to believe yet. "It changes that you weren't alone," she answered, "and that you never were." Before I could respond, her doorbell rang, a sharp ding-dong that split the air. She stood up slowly, went to open it, and a man appeared, early 40s, scruffy beard, leather jacket. "Mum, are you okay?" he asked. "Fine, son, come in." "This is Grace," she said, and I nodded slightly. "Daniel," he introduced himself, shaking my hand. "My mother has told me about you." "I hope not too much," I replied. He laughed, not mockingly, but with a kind of empathy. He had that look of a journalist or a cop, the kind of people used to smelling lies without saying anything. "I investigate things for a living," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "And this, Grace, smells like a case." "To me it smells like a bad TV drama," I said, though I couldn't help smiling. Daniel pulled a folder from his backpack and opened it on the table. It was full of photocopies of official documents, lists of names, handwritten notes. "I've been helping my mother for a while," he explained. "There are dozens of cases like hers: stolen babies, fake certificates, families deceived. If you want, I can look for your real birth record." The silence stretched. The idea seemed absurd, but also tempting. "And what do I gain from that?" I asked. "The truth," Helen said. "The truth always arrives late and always charges a fee," I replied, almost without thinking. Daniel watched me for a few seconds, then nodded. "Even so, I think it's worth it," he said, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice that annoyed me. We spent almost an hour going over papers. He explained details, showed me falsified seals, repeated signatures. Helen stayed silent, eyes fixed on me, as if afraid I might get up and leave again at any moment. I didn't. At one point, Daniel pulled a small photo from the folder and placed it in front of me. It showed a baby with a small scar behind the left ear. Instinctively, I put my hand to the same spot. "Coincidence," I said, but even to myself my voice didn't sound convincing. The living room clock chimed 10 at night. My body felt tired and my head on fire. I stood up slowly. "I need to think," I said. Helen walked me to the door. "Just think about one thing," she asked me. "If what I'm saying is a lie, you've got nothing to lose. But if it's true, you have a family that's been looking for you for more than half a century." I didn't know how to answer. I walked back home under the yellowish streetlights, the distant sound of cars, and that strange silence in neighborhoods where everyone has already had dinner. In the building entrance, I ran into Linda, my neighbor, coming back from the gym with a messy ponytail and an empty water bottle. "Where are you?" "Off to at this hour, Grace?" she asked, nosy as always. "Into trouble, apparently," I answered, smiling. We rode the elevator up together. I told her, roughly, about the photo, the woman who claimed to be my sister, the journalist's son. Linda clutched her chest. "Oh, Terry, that sounds like a scam." Don't open the door to those people. With social media, there are so many lunatics now. Don't worry, I said. If they want to rob me, they can take the plants. They're the only things I look after. She laughed, gave me a kiss on the cheek, and said goodbye. Back home, I dropped my coat, turned off the hallway light, and stayed standing in the dimness of the living room. I didn't want to think, but you can't switch your mind off by decree. I went to the hallway mirror and looked at myself closely, searching for something I didn't even know what it was. A sign, proof, an answer. All I saw was a tired woman, eyes a little red, with a stubborn mouth. In that reflection, though, there was a flicker of doubt, something new, almost imperceptible, as if under my skin another story were pushing to come out after waiting too long. I rested my hands on the mirror's frame and whispered, almost voiceless, if all of this is true, somebody better tell me soon, because I don't know if I've got the strength for another mystery. And I laughed to myself, that laugh that has no joy but keeps the tears away. Outside, a car sped past and the sound broke apart in the air. I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't sleep. I just stayed still, waiting for the night to tell me what the hell to do the next day. At dawn, I still had the same feeling in my body. It wasn't exactly fear or anguish either, more like a hum under the skin, like when you're about to remember something important, but the word just won't come. I did what I always do. Coffee, toast, radio. On the radio, they were talking about politics, football, prices, the same songs we've listened to for 20 years with different singers. But between one news item and the next, I caught myself looking at the little pendant that always hangs from my keyring, a small silver cross with engraved initials. I don't know why I looked at it. I don't know why, suddenly, the letters seemed clearer than ever. E.W., the same letters as Helen's surname. It wasn't a revelation in neon lights, more like a silent punch in the gut. I didn't think too long about it. I called Daniel. His voice over the phone sounded half asleep, half ready. We arranged to meet at 11 at the bar on the corner, the usual one, where the waiter has been there longer than the chairs. I got dressed without paying much attention to the wardrobe. Coat, scarf, that automatic gesture of someone trying not to think about herself. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, with a notebook full of papers and the tense look of someone who's been going over data for a while. He greeted me with a smile that stopped halfway between courteous and worried. "I've got something," he said as soon as I sat down. "I found a name that keeps popping up in several documents from the orphanage where you supposedly ended up." "Let me guess," I said sarcastically. "The Pope himself?" "No, Father Thomas. A retired priest. He lives in a village an hour from here." I didn't answer. I stirred my coffee with the spoon, no sugar, just for the sound. "My mother says he's the one who gave her the pendant when she was a girl," Daniel added. "That he promised to pray for the sister she was missing." I let out a short laugh. "Sure, and prayers work like birth certificates, right?" Daniel looked at me patiently. He didn't push. We left the bar soon after and he drove. The road to the village was long, gray, and damp, full of bends and dry fields. I stared out the window, trying not to think. But silence in a car always ends up saying more than you want. And, "What if you don't want to know the truth?" Daniel asked suddenly. "Curiosity doesn't switch off just like that," I replied. "But if I find out something that wrecks my life, I'm holding you responsible." He laughed, and the sound eased the tension a little. The village was small, with a church way too big for the few houses around it. We found Father Thomas in a parish home, an old building that smelled of candle wax and soup. A tiny nun led us down a hallway lined with crucifixes. At the end, in a room with a window onto the courtyard, he was there. A man in his 80s, very thin, skin like old paper, eyes still bright. "Father Thomas," Daniel greeted him. "We're here about an old story." The old man slowly lifted his gaze. "Old?" he repeated. "All stories are old, son." I stayed at the door, not coming in, just watching. He had a rosary in his hands and was turning it without praying. Daniel explained in a few sentences who I was, who Helen was. About the orphanage. The priest listened without interrupting, and when he finished, instead of answering, he looked straight at me. "Your face," he murmured. "The little one with the blue rosary?" The air in the room grew heavier. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "You were a restless baby. You cried a lot. You had that scar here." He pointed behind the ear. "Your sister called you the one with the blue rosary because we left a little cross in your crib so you'd stop crying." I swallowed with difficulty. Daniel took out his notebook. "We need to know what happened to those babies," he said. "We have documents pointing to irregular adoptions." Father Thomas sighed, lowered his eyes, and began to slowly turn the rosary between his fingers. "Those were hard times," he said. "Unmarried mothers, the poor, the ones with no one. They left their children, and there were families who could take better care of them. Arrangements were made." "Arrangements?" I cut in. "Is that what you called stealing babies?" The old man didn't answer. He seemed submerged in another era, as if his words were getting stuck in his throat. "I didn't understand back then," he went on. "I obeyed orders. The hospital belonged to the nuns, they decided. We only signed." "And my mother?" I asked. "The real one." He looked up at me. "She was very young. I remember her crying. She begged me to see you before they took her to the convent, but they wouldn't let her." For a few seconds, I didn't know whether to shout at him or hug him. "And what did you do?" I snapped. "I prayed," he said, his voice barely a sigh. I wanted to tell him prayers don't bring lives back, but Daniel put a hand on my arm. "No need." The old man was already undone. We left shortly after. At the door, the priest called out to me again. "Daughter," he said, "if you're looking for justice, you won't find it in the archives. But the truth, that always finds a way." Outside, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth. We walked to the car without speaking. Daniel lit a cigarette and offered me one, though I haven't smoked in 20 years. I took it anyway, just to have something to do with my hands. On the way back, the landscape looked different. The sky had that dull color of sunless afternoons, and in the rearview mirror I caught my own face, and for a moment it looked like someone else's. We stopped at a petrol station and bought water and a pack of biscuits. Daniel looked at me with that mix of compassion and respect I find uncomfortable. "Not all priests were guilty," he said, as if trying to justify something. "No, but some knew what was happening, and they kept quiet. That's guilt too." We stayed quiet for a while, each with our own thoughts. Before I got back in the car, Daniel handed me a folded sheet. "I found this last night," he said. "It's a list of children from the orphanage. Names, dates. One of them, Grace Marquez. Departure, not registered." I put the paper in my coat pocket without looking. I didn't need to. Just the sound of those words was enough to freeze me inside. I got home when it was already dark. Linda was leaning out over her balcony, shouting something about a movie on TV, but I barely heard her. I went up, dropped my coat on the chair, and took out the sheet. I spread it on the table, next to my photo box, and ran my finger over my name, the one I thought was mine. For the first time in many years, I didn't want to turn on the light. There's something truthful about the dark, even when it hurts. I stayed seated, listening to the distant noise of the lift, the murmur from the street, and thought of that little girl the priest had called the one with the blue rosary, and of the woman who was now trying to remember her. What came next wasn't a heroic decision or anything like that. It was more like being pushed from inside, like when you know you've got a rotten tooth and you keep putting off the dentist. But one day, the pain stops you pretending. That push came when I looked at the sheet with my miswritten name, the orphanage list on the table, and thought, almost out loud, that if anyone owed me an explanation about what the hell had happened, before priests and judges, it was the woman who taught me how to tie my shoelaces and to be afraid of the dark, because that's something parents teach you too, even if it doesn't show up in books. I didn't call anyone to ask for permission. Not Daniel, not Helen, not Linda. I dialed the number of the care home where Margaret was. I had it on a yellow note stuck to the fridge next to the shopping list. A nurse with a tired voice told me my mother had had a good night, that I could come in the morning, that she was calmer now they'd changed her medication. As if she were inviting me to a brunch with pills instead of toast. I said yes, I'd be there around 10:30, and hung up with the feeling I'd just scheduled an appointment with my own past in a room that smelled of bleach. Getting to the home felt strange, not because it was far 15 minutes by bus and 5 walking, but because I'd never gone there with so many questions in my head. Until then, my visits had been a mix of routine and well-managed guilt. A kiss on the forehead, talk about the weather, some small neighborhood gossip. Do they treat you well? Do you eat? Yes, dear, and back home with my conscience, a little lighter. That morning, though, every step I took thumped in my head like a, "Why didn't you ask earlier?" The lobby smelled of cheap perfume, soup, and disinfectant, that mix you come to associate with the end of the board. In the common room, the TV was on some talk show nobody was watching, but the noise filled a bigger silence. I greeted the receptionist from memory, signed the visitor's book, and took the lift up, with my hands in my pockets, feeling my heartbeat in my temples, an experience I do not recommend when you're about to demand answers from your almost 90-year-old mother. Margaret was sitting in her usual armchair by the window, a gray blanket over her legs, staring out at the garden as if something fascinating were happening out there. Though there were only geraniums and 2 nurses smoking in secret, her skin looked thinner, almost transparent, and her hair was pinned back in a small bun. When she heard the door, she turned her head and lit up with a sudden smile that made her look 10 years younger. "Oh, darling, I thought you weren't coming today," she said, as if I'd promised to be there at 8:30 sharp. I went over, kissed her forehead. She smelled of cheap moisturizer and something sweet, maybe biscuits. "I'm here," I answered, "though you might not like why. You always say strange things," she laughed, and it was brief but genuine. Then she looked more closely at me. "You look terrible, Grace. Aren't you sleeping?" Since 1963, apparently, I thought, but didn't say. I sat in the uncomfortable chair in front of her, the one I knew too well, and took a few seconds to really look at her, like I was seeing her for the first time. The spotted hands, thin fingers, wedding ring still on her finger, even though my father had left this world and every other years ago. My adoptive mother, but my mother all the same, because no paper, priest, or orphanage list could take that away. "Mum," I began, and the word came out rougher than usual. "I need you to tell me the truth." She squinted, as if the light bothered her. But it wasn't the light, it was the sentence. "The truth is a very unflattering fluorescent." "The truth about what?" she asked, with that mix of innocence and cunning she's always had. I took the crumpled orphanage sheet from my bag and laid it on her lap. Her fingers started smoothing the paper without reading it, as if she were ironing an invisible shirt. "About this," I said, "about how I ended up in your house." Her gaze dropped to the paper. I don't know if she could make out the words, but she understood something, because her jaw suddenly tightened and her smile faded. "Oh, Grace, not this again," she murmured. "You've always been so dramatic." I took a deep breath. That sentence hurt like a thimble pressing on an open wound. "These aren't my fantasies, Mum," I insisted, slower this time. "I went to see a priest, Father Thomas. Does that name ring a bell? He was at the hospital where—" I stopped a second. The word "you were born" got stuck in my throat where they handed me over. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were wetter. "That man," she whispered, "he always scared me." "Why?" I asked, and the question cut into me too. Margaret turned to the window, looking for something in the geraniums that wasn't there. "Back then, things were different," she began, and I already knew that whenever someone says that, what comes next is never pretty. Women who couldn't have children didn't have many options. I spent 10 years praying, going to doctors, crying silently so your father wouldn't hear me. And one day, Sister Judith told me there was a way, I repeated, feeling my hands go cold. "They called us to an office at the hospital," she went on, her voice sounding distant, like she was listening to herself from 40 years ago. "There was a nun, Father Thomas, and a man in a white coat who never said his name. They explained that there were babies who had no place to go, that no one would claim them, that they came from women who couldn't take care of them, that it would be better for everyone. They said if we made a donation to the center we could. She swallowed, her lip trembling. We could be parents to one of those little ones. And what did you think? I asked, not to judge her, but because I needed to know where her head was when my life was decided on some office desk. I thought God had finally listened to me, she answered, and her voice broke there. I didn't see papers or laws or anything. I only saw the possibility of coming home with a baby in my arms and finally shutting up the neighbors who kept asking when it was our turn. I looked out the window too, trying to picture her young, dark-haired, sitting on a hard chair, hands sweating in her lap, listening to people dressed in authority promising her a miracle in exchange for money and silence. Did they say anything about my biological parents? I pressed. Nothing. She shook her head. Just that you were a healthy girl, that you'd had complications at birth, but were fine. I believed everything. I wanted to believe it. I didn't ask questions. I was so scared they'd change their minds and say no. I accepted anything. She covered her face with her hands for a moment, like she wanted to hide inside her own fingers. And Dad? I asked. Did he know? He knew what I knew, she replied. Or that's what I want to think. He wrote the check, shook the priest's hand, and told me not to cry in front of them, that we shouldn't see it as a deal, but as an opportunity. The word check hit me hard. Suddenly I imagined myself, newborn, reduced to a number on a page, to a pile of notes changing hands while I slept in an incubator. I couldn't hide the grimace of disgust. So, yes, you paid, I said bluntly. We made a donation, she replied, almost automatically, like she was repeating a line she'd been told back then. To the hospital, to the nuns. We didn't buy a child, Grace. We adopted a daughter. A dense silence fell between us, like a brick wall built at different times. And you never wondered why there weren't normal papers? I went on, a mix of anger and curiosity. Why there are no photos of me as a baby? Why my birth certificate has crossings out? Margaret held my gaze for a long moment and, in those seconds, I saw the woman who held my hand to cross the street, who yelled at me when I came home late at 15, who spent sleepless nights when my fever spiked. I saw her, and I also saw someone who had made herself very small in front of a huge system that offered her what she wanted most. Of course I wondered, she whispered. But every time that doubt appeared, you laughed, or called me Mum, or brought me a drawing from school, and that voice went quiet. I didn't want to hear it. I would have liked to tell her I understood, that a desperate woman can do things she'll later regret, but I couldn't. All I felt was a kind of double tearing. On one side, the affection I had for her, the kind that doesn't vanish with paperwork. On the other, the anger of knowing that, at some point, someone had decided my life was negotiable, and that she, to be a mother, had chosen not to look too closely. Did you know I might have a sister? I blurted out suddenly, not sugarcoating it. She blinked several times, as if the word sister were coming from very far away. Sister Judith, she began. Once, many years later, when you were already running around the house and jumping on the sofa with your shoes on, she told me offhand that there had been complications during the birth, that you'd been one of two, but the other hadn't survived, that it was better not to think about it, that God had taken one and left the other as a gift. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. She didn't die, I said slowly. She's alive. Her name is Helen. And she spent her whole life looking for me. Margaret held my gaze for a few seconds, and I saw something pass through her eyes that wasn't pure surprise, more like the recognition of an old fear, like a suspicion she'd hidden away, had finally found proof. When you were little, she said, her voice a thin thread, sometimes I watched you sleeping and thought I didn't deserve you, that one day they'd come and take you away, tell me it had been a mistake, that the child wasn't mine. And I prayed no one would knock on the door. And now they have, I replied, a bit harsh. And it's not God, Mum, it's reality. Her chin began to tremble. She wasn't someone who cried often. Her generation had the habit of crying inwardly, as if tears were a luxury. "I always loved you," she said, and that sentence came out whole, without wavering. "With everything I had and everything I didn't. If what you're saying is true, if that woman, that Helen, is your sister, I don't know what to do with that pain. But I can't deny that you were my joy." I felt something loosen in my chest, but the wound stayed open. "I'm not here to strip you of the title of mother," I said, my voice softer now. "I'm here because I need to know who I was before I was yours." She nodded, very slowly. "I can't tell you," she admitted. "I don't know, and that's what kills me." We stayed there in silence for a while, both of us staring at the paper on her lap, where my name appeared as just another in a list of lost children. Around us, aides pushed wheelchairs past. Someone laughed in the next room. The TV blared detergent ads. Life went on with its absurd normality, while I tried to piece together my identity from scraps of late confessions. Then I saw the little drawer in the bedside table next to her bed, the drawer where she kept her important things, a rosary, a photo of my father, an old comb. I opened it without asking. Part of me knew I was crossing a line, but the urgency to find something was stronger. Inside, folded carefully, was a thin, yellowed envelope. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. Margaret looked at it, and her face darkened. "They gave it to me at the hospital," she whispered. "They said it was paperwork I didn't need, that I could throw it away. I never opened it. I was afraid." I could have told her off, but instead, I tore the edge open with clumsy hands. Inside, there wasn't a contract or a birth certificate. There was a small note, written in haste, the scared handwriting of someone who hadn't had time or permission to say much. "Forgive me, daughter. If you ever read this, I want you to know I didn't abandon you. They forced me. I've been looking for you since 1963. I felt the air leave my lungs." It was the same sentence, the same sentence, the same scream crossing decades. "What does it say?" Margaret asked, because her eyesight wasn't up to it. I swallowed. I could have lied, but I was too tired of half-truths. "It says your donation wasn't as clean as they told you," I answered, with bitter irony. "It says my biological mother didn't leave me by choice. It says, someone's been looking for me since before you held me in your arms." She fixed her eyes on the window and muttered something I barely heard. "So I kept a gift that wasn't mine." I didn't know what to do with that sentence, whether to hug her or run away. I leaned in, took her hand. It felt as fragile as wet paper. "You kept me," I said, "and I'm not erasing that. But now I have to see what else there is of me out there." She nodded again, resigned, like someone who knows you can't budge the past, not even with all the prayers in the world. "Go," she whispered. "Find out everything. And if that woman, your other mother, is still alive, tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I was fooled too, but that doesn't change the fact that I loved you. I didn't promise anything. At that age, promises tend to break on their own." But I squeezed her hand a little harder. As I left her room, I walked down the long corridor, full of doors with names written on colorful signs. Each name hid a story, piles of decisions taken and not taken, secrets maybe nobody would ever ask about. The smell of disinfectant hit my nose like a slap. When I stepped out into the street, the cold air hit my face, and I was grateful for the cold, because in that moment, it was the only honest thing. I took my phone from my bag, dialed Daniel's number, and, while I listened to the ringing tone, I thought it was funny that, at my age, with my life supposedly settled, I was finally starting to ask the questions I'd never had the courage to ask before. When Daniel answered, I didn't even let him say hello. "There's a letter," I said, almost out of breath, "from someone signed with an E," and she wrote that sentence again. He stayed quiet for a moment on the other end, and when he spoke, his voice had a different shade, deeper. "Then it's not just a suspicion anymore, Grace," he said. "It's a lead." I looked back at the home, at the window of Margaret's room, and felt my life split into three. The one I'd lived with her, the one that had been stolen from me, and the one I still didn't know how to build. Daniel picked me up outside the home without questions. He just rolled down the window and gave me a sideways look with that quiet discretion of people who know when not to talk. I got into the car with the letter still folded in my bag, like a time bomb wrapped in thin paper. I said nothing for the first few minutes. The city slid by outside the window, traffic lights blinking like they were hesitating, and the traffic had that constant murmur that can sound like the sea if you insist on listening with your eyes closed. Daniel spoke first. He said he'd convinced an old colleague, a retired inspector, to check some adoption files from the nuns' hospital. The woman Harris had worked in forged documents and knew half the people in the courts. We met her in a Pause's bar near the provincial archive, a place that smelled of reheated coffee and formica tables, where case files passed from hand to hand like old decks of cards. The inspector was a woman in her late 50s, short red-dyed hair, bitten nails, and a gaze that examined you without asking permission. As soon as we sat down, she fired a straight question. Are you ready to see your name on a piece of paper that isn't yours? If that means stopping being a walking doubt, yes, I replied. She nodded, took a blue folder from her bag, and opened it slowly. Inside were copies of birth certificates, medical reports, seals stamped with violent dried-out rubber. The problem, she explained, flipping through the pages, is that in the 60s, documentation was a joke. You could change a name or a date and no one noticed. But some records, the congregation's records, keep duplicates with notes they forgot to erase. She stopped on a sheet and slid it toward me. In the margin, in a different handwriting, there was a note. Confidential transfer, internal order, Collins family. Ring any bells? She asked. Daniel and I exchanged a look, he answered. There's a Dr. Collins who worked there. He's retired. Father Thomas mentioned him. Harris closed the folder, lit a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign on the wall, and said, Then that's where you need to go. That man knows more than he says. And be careful, because old sins have young descendants who protect them. We left the bar with our heads full of names. The archive was 2 streets away, and we decided to go in anyway, even though we already knew most answers were hiding elsewhere. The corridors smelled of damp and dead paper. A clerk with crooked glasses greeted us with that mix of apathy and curiosity people have when they know they guard ghosts. Daniel explained what we were looking for, and the man, after a bit of huffing, led us into a room of metal filing cabinets. Each drawer weighed as much as a decade. The sound of metal as they opened groaned like a complaint. We spent hours combing through names, dates, scribbles. It all blended together. Children, numbers, Latin notes. At some point, the clerk, who'd gone for coffee, came back carrying a different, smaller file, and said almost lazily, This was in the religious documents section. No idea why. It's got the same stamp as the hospital you're after. Daniel opened it and started leafing through. I watched his hands, quick and precise, like they were touching something alive. Suddenly, he stopped, looked at me, and pointed at a page. Look at this. It was a black and white photograph, stuck down with old tape, 2 babies in a nurse's arms. Behind them, a woman who could have been Helen, younger, with a bow in her hair. On the photo's edge, an almost illegible note. Twins, the 11th of April 2063, Case E. My breathing got loud. I had to brace myself against the table. It can't be, I murmured. Daniel said nothing. He slammed the file shut and pushed it into his backpack. We're taking it, he said. If they think we'll leave this here, they're mistaken. I didn't argue. I was too busy trying to remember if, as a child, I'd ever dreamt of another girl like me, a shadow, a doubled voice. Nothing. Just the hollow of a memory that had never existed. When we stepped outside, the air felt cleaner, like the city knew something I didn't yet. We walked to the car in silence, but once inside I realized I needed to say something, anything, even if it was absurd. My adoptive mother gave me a letter, I told him. She'd kept it all these years. A woman with an M wrote it, said she was looking for me. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we're following her trail, he said. M for Marquez, M for Mother. The car rolled through gray streets, and I thought of Margaret, of how she'd held that envelope without opening it for decades, how hard it had been for her to admit she'd closed her eyes on purpose. I felt a stab of compassion, and anger too, because love doesn't excuse silence, no matter what people say. By the time we reached my neighborhood, it was almost dark. I asked Daniel to drop me on the corner. I needed to walk a bit alone. We said goodbye without ceremony. He stayed in the car, watching me go, with that expression halfway between respect and concern. I walked slowly up the street, shop lights reflecting in puddles, and turning the corner, I saw Linda, my neighbor, sitting on a bench with a grocery bag at her feet. She waved for me to come over. "I was waiting for you," she said. "You've been weird these days. What's going on?" I told her just enough, that I discovered something about my origins, that everything pointed to a hospital, priests, and fake papers. Linda listened, mouth slightly open. "Good Lord, Teray, that's Netflix material," she said. "Or nightmare material," I replied. She pulled a can of beer from the bag and handed it to me. We opened them there under the streetlight and drank in silence. It was the first time in days I felt something like calm, even if it was a borrowed calm. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked. "Keep going," I said. "I can't stay in limbo." Linda tapped my arm lightly, like she was waking me up. "Well, if you ever need me to come with you, you know, I've got time and curiosity." I laughed, without much joy. Curiosity, I thought, was the thread dragging me from place to place, not letting me rest. That night I didn't open the photo box or the letter. I just took the file Daniel had left me, put it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. I focused on the blurred hospital stamp, on the barely legible name of Dr. Collins, on the dates repeating like an echo. It was as if all that dead paper were breathing, holding a story that refused to stay quiet. At some point, I realized I've been resting my hand on the top of the file for several minutes, and that my breathing had slowed so much it sounded like someone else's. I closed my eyes, and for an instant I swear I heard a voice, a whisper so faint it could have been the wind or my memory. "I've been looking for you since 1963. I opened my eyes with a start. Everything was the same. The lamp on, the window closed, the file silent in front of me. I laughed to myself, that dry laugh that slips out when fear touches the back of your neck. "Well, here I am," I said to the air. "If you were looking so hard, you've found me." And with that sentence, not knowing whether it was a challenge or surrender, I stayed there, sleepless, waiting for morning so I could keep digging up the remains of a truth that smelled more and more like old gunpowder. The next morning, the phone rang before the coffee had even finished brewing, and I knew it was Daniel before I looked at the screen. I don't know why that happens. With some people, you feel them before you hear them. I picked up without saying hello. He spoke fast, like someone afraid the impulse might fade if he paused to breathe. He'd found Dr. Collins, the name on the archive stamp. The doctor lived in a house out in the mountains, semi-retired, or so they said, though he was still taking private patients off the books. Daniel wanted us to go that same day, and didn't wait for my answer. "I'll bring the car. I'll pick you up at 4. He hung up before I could say yes, which suited me fine, because I wasn't sure I wanted to keep going. I spent the rest of the morning prowling around the flat like an animal, looking for somewhere to hide. I showered, tidied a drawer, threw away old letters, talked to the ficus more kindly than usual. When the clock hit 3:30, I realized I already had my coat on, my bag packed, keys in hand. You don't need courage to follow a story, you just need not to know how to stop. Daniel turned. Up on time, the car full of papers and smelling of tobacco. He looked at me and didn't ask how I was, he just started the engine. In the glove compartment, there was a crumpled map, a thermos of coffee, a notebook full of notes. I wondered when my life had become a police investigation. The drive was long and winding, a landscape of dry hills and tiny, sleepy villages. On the way, Daniel told me about his father, a man who disappeared in '76. "Another story of silence," he said, and his voice dimmed. Without him spelling it out, I understood his determination to help me was also a way of looking for something of his own. We reached the house at dusk. It was a low building with cracked plaster, surrounded by trees and that winter smell of damp earth and firewood. We rang the bell, and a tired-looking man in his 70s opened the door, wrinkled shirt, slight tremor in his right hand. He looked at us without surprise, like he'd been waiting for visitors for a long time. "Dr. Collins," Daniel said in a neutral tone. "We need to talk to you." He hesitated a moment, then stepped aside to let us in. Inside, it smelled of medicine and old paper. He took us to the living room, where a heater was on and a portrait of him in a white coat hung crooked on the wall. "What do you want?" he asked, standing. "Information about Street Ann's Hospital," Daniel began. "The 60s. Adoptions." Collins closed his eyes for a second and ran a hand over his face. "That time," he murmured. "There's not a day I don't curse it." His tone was hard to read, regret or fear. "You signed some of those transfers," Daniel pressed. "We want to know what happened to the babies." The doctor walked over to the window, drew the curtain back a little, like he was afraid someone might be listening. "They were orders," he said at last. "Young mothers, unmarried, the ones who made trouble, were considered unfit. The babies were given to suitable families. That's what they said. It was a system, well-oiled. We just signed the certificates." "And did you get paid for that?" I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked at me and, for the first time, seemed to really see me. "Not all of us," he said. "Some of us received donations, others just kept quiet to keep our jobs. But the money moved. It always does." "Does this name ring a bell?" I asked, showing him the photocopy from the archive with the note, Case E. The old man took it, studied it for a few seconds, and nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes. The mother insisted on seeing her before she died. They didn't let her. I think her name was Evelyn. Evelyn Marquez." My stomach clenched. "Did she die?" "I don't know," he said. "They took her out soon after, said they were sending her to a convent. I never saw her again." Daniel took notes in his notebook. I couldn't take my eyes off the doctor's hands that had held newborns, signed certificates, sealed destinies. "And this mark?" I asked, pointing behind my ear. "A small scar." He frowned, searching his memory. "Old incubators," he said eventually. "Sometimes a metal clip would fall loose, or the skin would get scraped. Nothing serious." "Nothing serious," he repeated. I laughed, a short, dry laugh that sounded completely out of place, even to me. "Nothing serious," I echoed. "Just a tiny detail." Silence sank between us like fog. Daniel broke it, speaking softly. "We need documents, anything that proves the transfers." Collins went to a bookshelf, pulled out a dusty folder, and dropped it on the table. Inside were photos, loose papers, newspaper clippings. One of the photos showed him younger, surrounded by nuns and babies wrapped in blankets. He pointed to a corner of the picture. "You're here," he said, looking at me. "Or someone identical to you." I leaned in and looked. It was impossible to be sure the face was just a baby's, but the idea of being in that photo made me feel like the floor was shifting. Collins lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and exhaled slowly. "Don't look for justice," he said. "The people responsible are gone. The records have disappeared. If you dig too much, you'll only find fake names and ownerless graves." Daniel closed his notebook and put it away without replying. I, however, couldn't keep quiet. "And how do you sleep, doctor?" I asked. "How do you not hear those babies crying when you turn out the light?" He held my gaze for a second, then looked away. "Badly," he said. "I've slept badly for years." There wasn't much more to say. He walked us to the door, shook our hands with a shaky grip, and, before closing it, muttered something I barely caught. "Sometimes I think the ones who survive deserve to know. Maybe that's the only thing I can still do." When the car started, I sat in silence, watching the dark landscape slide past the window. Daniel said nothing either, maybe giving me space. After a few kilometers, without looking at him, I said, "You know we can't stop this now." "I know," he replied. "But we need to be careful. Those people still have power. At this point, the only thing I'm worried about is reaching the truth alive," I said. He smiled faintly. Back in the city, he offered to walk up to the flat with me. I agreed. We took the lift without speaking. In the hallway, a radio was playing some badly recorded love song. Inside, I made him coffee. We sat in the living room, both facing Collins's folder open on the table. At the very bottom, there was a document we hadn't looked at yet. A typed sheet, a list of names with a confidential stamp. At the top, a header. Project Hope, Special Assignments. "What's this?" I asked. Daniel pulled the sheet closer and read carefully. "A parallel registry," he said. "They called them assignments. Babies delivered without legal process, but with ecclesiastical approval." "Then I must be on there," I whispered. He nodded. The living room clock struck 8. The street had gone quiet. I stood up, walked to the window, and opened it. The cold air hit my face, and for the first time in many days, I took a deep breath. I don't know if it was relief or surrender, but I felt something ease inside. "Sometimes I think," I said without turning, "that my life didn't start when I was born, but when someone decided to lie about my birth." Daniel didn't answer. I heard the click of his lighter, the tiny burst of flame. "Then you'll have to rewrite it," he said at last. That simple sentence echoed in my head as I stared at the city lights in the distance. I thought of Margaret, of the woman who had signed my letter, of the priest, of the doctor. Each of them, in their own way, had had their share of shadow and fear. That night, when Daniel left, I didn't turn on any lights. I stayed in the living room, alone, papers spread out, cold air entering through the window, and the feeling that something was finally moving under all those years of silence. I wasn't the one who broke the news. It was Daniel. He did it without warning, with that mix of courage and clumsiness journalists have when they think truth justifies chaos. That morning, while I was making breakfast, I heard my name on the radio, not the usual one, the other one, the one I'd only just started to accept, and I froze with my toast halfway to my mouth, listening as they summarized my life in 3 sentences. A retired woman discovers she was stolen at birth, and her case could expose a network of illegal adoptions in England in the 60s. Then they said the hospital's name, the nuns, and the doctors, and I knew Daniel had pulled the cord without waiting for me. I slammed the radio off. My heart was thudding like I'd climbed stairs, and just then, the phone rang. Of course it was him. He didn't apologize, he just said the report had come out that morning, and it was now impossible to stop anything. "The story isn't just yours anymore, Grace," he said, and though he was right, I hung up without replying. The calls started minutes later. First Helen, crying, scared, saying the neighbors had seen her on the news, that journalists were waiting outside her door. Then a young journalist's voice, polite but insistent, wanting an interview to humanize the case. Then an unknown number I let ring out. Messages piled up in my voicemail, some supportive, others full of morbid curiosity. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee going cold on the table, feeling like someone had thrown open all the windows of my life and was watching from the street. I went out with my coat on and sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. On the corner, Linda was waiting, phone in hand, waving her arms like she was announcing a rescue. "Grace!" she shouted. "You're everywhere!" "Wonderful," I said, not stopping. "Just what I needed at my age, a bit of fame." "No, seriously, you're on TV," she insisted, jogging after me. "They put up an old photo of you, the one with the blue dress, remember?" "No, and I'd rather not." I cut her off. Linda caught up and grabbed my arm. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. I suppose keep breathing." Back at my building, a young reporter was waiting in the doorway. He approached with a nervous smile and a microphone tucked in his coat. He said he was from a local channel, that they just wanted "a few minutes, ma'am, so people can understand your story." I gave him that mix of pity and disdain I save for the naive. "To understand my story," I told him. You'd need to live 70 years with a borrowed name. If you've got time for that, I'll make you a coffee. He didn't know whether to laugh or apologize. I squeezed past his questions and went upstairs without looking back. When I shut the flat door, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was a silence full of distant murmurs, cameras flashing, other people's curiosity. I realized I'd lost more than my anonymity. I'd lost control of the story. And for someone who's always needed to tidy things, that felt almost like an amputation. By mid-afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, it was Emily, my daughter. We hadn't spoken in weeks. Her voice sounded tense. I couldn't tell if it was worry or anger. "Mom, what have you done?" she asked, no preamble. "I just saw you on the news." "I didn't do anything," I replied. "Daniel did." "And who's Daniel?" "A journalist, a friend, or an accomplice. I'm not sure. And this thing about being stolen at birth, is it true or just another of your dramas?" The question hurt more than I let on. I gave a little laugh that came out wrong. "I wish it were made up. Drama. Love. It would be easier." There was a long silence on the other end. Then she sighed. "I'm catching a flight," she said. "I'm not leaving you alone in the middle of this." "You don't have to, Emily." "I'm fine." "Mum," she cut in. "Don't be stubborn. See you tomorrow." She hung up before I could answer. I stared at the phone, feeling that tomorrow, like a truce, I didn't know whether to thank or fear. After dark, there was a knock at my door. It was Daniel, looking exhausted, a folded newspaper under his arm. I let him in without speaking. He put the paper on the table, my face on the front page, from an old photo I'd once shown him. The headline read, "Woman looks for truth after half a century of silence." "What did you hope to achieve with this?" I asked at last. "Who were you trying to impress?" Daniel sat down, ran a hand through his hair. "I wanted to make sure no one could bury it," he said. "So if they try to erase the files, it's too late." I didn't know whether to hate him or hug him. In a way, he was right. The story was public now, and the fear was changing sides. "Helen's frightened," I said. "She says she can't leave the house." "That's normal," he replied. "But people are listening to her now. We're not just two crazy old women chasing ghosts." "Speak for yourself," I said. "I am a crazy old woman." He laughed, tired, and took a small recorder out of his pocket. "I've got something else," he said. "A nurse who worked at the hospital contacted me. She says she remembers your biological mother. She might know where she ended up." The idea left me speechless. I just looked at him, waiting. "She's in a home in the South," he added, "but she's not well. Her memory's partly gone. They want us to go as soon as possible, in case she still remembers." I asked for a glass of water to buy time. When I came back, he was still there, recorder in hand. "I don't know if I can handle that," I admitted. "I don't know if I want to see her like that, not knowing who I am." "You're not doing it just for yourself," he said. "You're doing it for Helen too." I sat down again. Outside, night fell over the city, and the hum of traffic seeped through the open window. "All right," I said finally. "But we go without cameras, without reporters, without noise. If I'm going to meet her, I want to do it in peace." Daniel nodded. The next morning, as we drove south, the city was already awake, and my story was still on every screen. I carried no luggage, just my bag with the letter, the documents, and the pendant. As the car rolled on, the news kept talking about me, the stolen babies, the nuns, the doctors. I watched the landscape pass by and thought that if this whole thing was a hurricane, at least it had hit me while I was awake. Emily texted before takeoff, "Don't you dare die without telling me the ending." I smiled to myself, old tenderness stirring. Truth, I thought, doesn't have an ending, just pauses. And as the road stretched out ahead and the sky cleared, I knew what was coming wasn't an interview, or a headline, or a neat closure. It was another door opening, one of those that don't shut even if you want them to, because behind it There's someone who's been waiting their whole life for you to arrive." We reached the home mid-morning, a gray 70s block, the kind that looked like nobody comes out happy. There was a small garden with a couple of benches and a dry fountain, and on the front, a rusty plaque with crooked letters. Street. Raphael Home. The name seemed ironic. There was nothing holy or homely about it. The smell of disinfectant mixed with reheated soup, and the corridor echoed with nurses pushing trolleys. Daniel was a few steps ahead, clutching the envelope of documents like a passport, and I just followed, feeling the air get thicker with each meter. A young woman in a blue uniform and a kind but distant look, someone who'd clearly learned not to get too attached, greeted us. We explained who we were there to see, and she checked a handwritten logbook, running the tip of her pen down the lines until she stopped. "Evelyn Marquez," she read. "Room 212, but she's fragile, has gaps. Sometimes she doesn't even remember her own name." "That's okay," I said. "Maybe she'll remember me." I didn't know if I said it with hope or fear. The nurse led us down a long hallway with crooked floral prints on the walls and that stubborn smell of bleach. Each door had a number and a name, people waiting, not quite sure for what. At the end of the hall, a window let in sharp winter light. Room 212 was quiet. Inside, a very thin woman with completely white hair sat in a wheelchair facing the window. Her hands rested on a blanket, eyes fixed on something invisible. She was small, almost transparent, and yet, when I saw her, something inside me tightened, like an invisible thread tugging me toward her. "Evelyn," the nurse said softly, "you've got visitors." The woman slowly turned her head with the weary movement of someone long suspended between dreams and reality. Her eyes, pale blue and cloudy, landed on me, and for a moment I felt the air stop. She didn't speak, but she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "I'm Grace," I said, taking a step forward. "Grace." I didn't finish. Which last name was I supposed to use? The one of the woman who raised me, or the one of the woman who brought me into the world? I got stuck halfway, nameless, which felt like the perfect definition of what I was. She blinked a couple of times, her gaze flickering. "Grace," she repeated at last, in a thread of voice. "That's what you were called." Her words went through me with slow, painful force. I moved closer, knelt down beside her. Her skin smelled of soap, and something sweet, like dust and melted caramel. "Do you remember me?" I asked, almost voiceless. "Always," she whispered. "Even when they told me I'd made you up." Daniel stayed back, silent, watching. The nurse slipped out gently, leaving us alone. "I read your letter," I said. "The one you left with the envelope." Evelyn gave a faint smile, a fragile grimace. "I thought you'd never see it, that they'd burn it like they burned everything else." I didn't know what to say. Anger and tenderness were mixing inside me in a way that made my head spin. "Another woman raised me," I went on. "She loved me, but nobody told me who you were. They wouldn't let me see you," she said, eyes filling but not spilling. "They told me you died, that I shouldn't cry. But I heard you cry. You had a strong voice, like you were protesting against the world." I closed my eyes for a second. I tried to picture it. The hospital, the nun, the crying, but the images were blurry, borrowed. "Why didn't you get help?" I asked. "Why wait so long?" "Because back then nobody listened to a woman alone," she replied. "And because they took everything from me, papers, money, my last name, but not the guilt. That I kept." Her voice was fragile but firm, the voice of someone who has lived with an open wound for far too long. "Your sister," she said suddenly, and the word sister hit me hard. "Helen." She cried too. "They wouldn't let me keep her, but I used to sneak to the convent to see her. I talked to her about you, even though she didn't understand." The image split me in two. One girl visited in secret, the other ripped away. 70 years between them. "She's alive," I told her. "Helen's alive, and she knows everything now." Her lips trembled, and for a second her voice seemed to disappear. "And is she all right?" "Yes. She's all right. She made it. Then I can go in peace. She grabbed my hand with unexpected strength. Her fingers were all bone and skin, but the gesture was that of a mother clinging to something she still needs to say. "Don't forgive me," she whispered. "It's no use. But tell it. Let them know what they did. It wasn't our fault." I nodded, unable to speak. Daniel stepped closer and laid a hand on my shoulder. Evelyn looked at him, as if understanding who he was. "Thank you," she said to him, "for bringing her." Daniel bowed his head, uncomfortable. She turned back to me, her eyes full of a mix of relief and sorrow unlike anything I'd seen before. "You've got his hands," she murmured. "Your father's." "What was his name?" I asked. "Robert," she replied, barely audible. "He died without knowing you were alive." The name dropped into the air like a stone into a pond. I repeated it in my head, Robert, Robert, until it dissolved into noise. We stayed a long time without speaking. Sometimes, silence between mother and daughter doesn't need filling. She was tiring, closing her eyes and opening them again, fighting off sleep. Before we left, she asked one more thing. "If you see her again," she said, "Helen, tell her I'm sorry. She was my punishment and my salvation." I promised I would, though I wasn't sure how much that promise meant. When we left the room, the nurse gave us a soft, almost complicit look. "She hasn't talked that much in weeks," she said. "I think she was waiting for you." The corridor felt longer on the way back, or maybe it was just me walking slower. My legs were heavy, my head full of new images. Outside, the sun shone on the garden trees, and a group of old men played dominoes under a parasol. Life, indifferent, carried on. Daniel offered me a cigarette and I took it, though I'd given up smoking years ago. We sat on a bench by the dry fountain. "And now what?" he asked, without looking at me. "Now," I said, blowing out smoke. "Now I have to start believing it." He nodded. "Want me to call Helen?" "No, I want to do it myself. But not yet." We fell silent. The wind rustled the leaves, and the smell of tobacco mixed with the chlorine from the garden. I thought of my adoptive mother, my biological mother, the woman I am now, and realized they all lived in the same body, coexisting like polite ghosts. On the drive back, Daniel switched on the radio out of habit. The news was covering the reopened stolen baby cases. My name came up again, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. It was just a fact, like time or rain. I watched the home shrink in the distance through the window. It hit me that I hadn't cried. Not yet. Maybe because, deep down, I'd understood something I couldn't yet say out loud. There is no right way to be reborn, but some lives, no matter how stolen, insist on blooming, even in ruins. And there, in the middle of the road, engine humming and wind. Against the windows, I knew the worst part hadn't been everyone else's silence, but my own. And that silence, finally, was over. We got back from the home at dusk, and the return journey was unlike any before. We didn't talk, didn't even look at the scenery. Daniel drove with steady hands, but his knuckles were white, like he was holding back something he didn't know how to say. I stared at the road without seeing it, my head full of images that weren't mine and yet felt like they were. Evelyn's trembling voice saying Robert, her fading smile, her cold hand gripping mine. Inside, I felt a strange calm, not relief, but exhaustion. That false peace that comes when there are no urgent questions left, and all you can do is hope the quiet becomes bearable. Back in the city, Daniel stopped the car outside my building and left the engine running for a few seconds. "Grace," he said, still not looking at me. "This is going to grow. More people want to talk. Journalists, families. It isn't just about you anymore." "It was never just about me," I replied. "I was just the first stone that dropped." "We need to decide whether to go on," he added, almost professionally. "Whether to make Evelyn public, whether to name names." "Do whatever you want, Daniel. I've done my part." "And what's your part?" "To listen and survive it." We sat in silence. Outside, a group of kids walked past laughing, oblivious. Life carried on, Before I got out, I said something I hadn't planned. Thanks for pulling on the thread, even if it broke me. He nodded and didn't try to say anything else. Sometimes, silence is the only way you can say thank you. Upstairs, I found the answering machine full of new messages. The first few were from Emily, saying she'd arrived in London and would come over that evening. Then one from Helen, voice shaky, saying she'd dreamt about Evelyn and needed to talk. And finally, a message from an unknown number, an older woman's voice, deep, saying only, "I know who signed your papers. Don't talk to anyone else. They're listening to us." I rewound it 3 times to be sure of what I'd heard. The voice was harsh, tired, and the call had come from a hidden number. I sat in front of the phone listening to the end beep, feeling like yet another door had opened, with something behind it I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Emily arrived around 9, in a long coat and looking worn out. We didn't hug right away. She stood in the doorway, looking me up and down, like she needed to check I was the same mother she'd always had and not that woman from the news. "You've lost weight," she said finally, coming in. "Revelations kill your appetite," I tried to joke, and failed. She took off her coat, dropped it on the sofa, and sat across from me. She had the same way of looking as I do, that mix of tenderness and mistrust. "I saw everything," she said. "The report, the interviews. I didn't know whether to come." "Why wouldn't you?" "Because I'm scared of getting to know you all over again. That hurt more than any accusation." "I'm still your mother, Emily," I said, my voice trembling. "Stolen, borrowed, or adopted, but your mother." She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "I don't doubt that," she said at last. "But you're also another woman's daughter, and I don't know how to process that." "Neither do I admitted. "I don't even know which name to answer to when people talk to me." We laughed a little, a sad, shared laugh, the first crack in the distance between us. Later, I told her everything. The letter, the doctor, the visit to Evelyn. I left nothing out. Emily listened without interrupting, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. When I finished, she stared at the floor for a long time. "And the other one?" she asked. "The one who grew up with you?" "Helen," I said. "My sister. She's alive." Emily looked up. "Do you know her well?" "No, but I think I'm starting to remember her without having lived her." She didn't ask me to explain. She just nodded, like she understood that some bonds don't need shared stories, only a space in your chest. We ate a little, talked about smaller things to disguise the exhaustion. When she left, she gave me a sentence at the door that stuck with me. "Mum, if you're going to keep going with this, make sure they don't erase you again." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the sofa with Daniel's recorder, listening to the interviews he'd done with other families, mothers and siblings looking for missing children. Each voice was an echo of the same horror. In the middle of one tape, I recognized the voice from the message. Deep, slow, giving names of nuns, dates, hospitals. She introduced herself as Sister Agnes, former secretary at the hospital. I called Daniel right away, even though it was 2 a.m. He answered hoarsely. "You heard her too?" he asked, before I could speak. "Yes," I said. "And she left a message at my place. Says she knows who signed my papers. Then we need to see her. Tomorrow." "And if it's a trap?" "At this point, everything's a trap, Grace. But this one might give us what we're missing." I hung up and stared at the window for a while. Outside, the lights of the neighborhood seemed dimmer. I thought of Evelyn, of Margaret, of Helen, of Emily, of all the women who'd carried pieces of the same lie, each believing her story was the only one. At dawn, I stepped out onto the balcony with the letter in my hand. I opened it again, even though I knew it by heart. The ink was fainter, the paper starting to tear at the folds. "I've been looking for you since 1963. It was no longer a sentence, it was a heartbeat. I lit a cigarette I didn't finish and made myself one promise. This search was going to end. With me, or with me alive, but it wasn't going to pass on to others." Inside, the phone started ringing again, insistent. I let it ring, Let it fill the flat with constant noise, because for the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't the one who had to rush to answer. It was the truth that was on its way to me. And this time, I wasn't planning to hide behind any name. We met Sister Agnes 3 days later in a cafe near King's Cross Station, a small place with marble tables and the smell of stale coffee, the kind of place that exists only for conversations nobody should overhear. Daniel arrived first and sat in a corner with his back to the wall. I took the seat opposite and ordered water. I didn't want my hands to shake. When she walked in, I recognized her at once, even without a habit. A woman well into her 80s, very straight-backed, in a beige coat and white scarf around her neck. She walked slowly, but with such dignity she demanded respect. She came over, looked me in the eyes, and said my name like she'd been practicing all night. Grace. I didn't get up, but I nodded. She sat without help, set her bag on the table, and rested her thin, trembling hands on the edge. Her fingers were marked with age spots, and she wore a worn wedding band that seemed fused to her skin. I shouldn't be here, she began in a low voice. But at my age, fear is useless. Daniel thanked her for coming and explained we just wanted to understand. She gave him a slightly disdainful look. Men always want to understand when there's nothing left to save, she said, eyes never leaving mine. We women understood everything from the start, even when they made us keep quiet. Her voice was firm, almost no tremor. I took Evelyn's letter from my bag and laid it on the table. The nun's eyes locked onto the signature like it was a relic. I watched her write that letter, she said. She asked me for paper and a pen, but Father Thomas was watching. They threatened to expel me if I said anything. That woman lived through hell on earth. Why did they do it? I asked, feeling my throat close. Because they could. Because they had power and called it morality, she answered without hesitation. The hospital received donations from rich families who couldn't have children. The priests justified the reallocations as charity. And the nuns. She paused, took a long breath. The nuns obeyed. They told us we were saving souls, but really, we were hiding crimes. The coffee arrived, but none of us touched it. Outside, cars roared past with that endless city hum. Sister Agnes reached into her bag and pulled out a yellow envelope. She slid it toward me. "This is the missing record," she said. "I kept it all these years, waiting for someone to ask. It has your real name and the signatures of the people who authorized the handover." Daniel opened it carefully, took out a folded sheet, and spread it on the table. There were official stamps, a date 4 November 1963, and 3 signatures. I recognized one immediately, Margaret's, my adoptive mother. Another was Father Thomas. The third was illegible, but Sister Agnes tapped it with her finger. "That's the name of the man who ran it all," she said. "Cardinal Blake. He died in 1982, with full honors, never answered for anything." I stared at the sheet for a long time, trying to work out what I should feel. This was the document that confirmed everything, my origin, the lie, the theft. And yet, I didn't feel the explosion I'd expected. Just a deep tiredness, an acceptance that hurt less than I'd imagined. "Why did you keep it?" I asked. "Because I thought one day you'd come," she replied. "Not you exactly, but one of yours. Daughters of silence always come back." Her words chilled me. I didn't know whether to thank or resent her for waiting so long. Daniel took the sheet and tucked it into his martyr's folder, as if he feared the air might dissolve it. The nun stood up slowly. "It's done now," she said. "Don't look for me again. What's left you'll find in the Street Veronica Convent archives, but you must hurry. Soon all of this will go up in flames." We paid for the untouched coffee. Before leaving, she brushed my cheek with her hand. "Your mother was brave. You are too, but don't let guilt steal what's left of your life." She walked away without looking back. Her figure vanished into the crowd, and for a moment I thought I saw Evelyn, Margaret, all the women who had carried that guilt without knowing how to set it down. Daniel and I left the cafe in silence. We walked along the pavement while the city roared as if nothing had happened. At the corner, I asked him to leave me alone for a while. I needed time without witnesses. I walked aimlessly, envelope pressed to my chest, until I found myself in the park where I used to take Emily as a child. I sat on the same bench under the big elm and unfolded the sheet again. I read every line, every signature, every date, until the ink blurred with tears I hadn't let myself cry before. I didn't cry for me, or for Evelyn, or for Margaret. I cried for all the lives lost in those hospital corridors, for the children who grew up with borrowed names, for the mothers who waited for letters that never came. I felt my story was just one of thousands, another echo in a cathedral of voices that had learned only to whisper. When the sun started to go down, I took out my phone and called Helen. She took a while to answer, and when she did, her voice was weak, like she'd been crying too. "I found her," I told her. "Our mother." There was a long silence. "I felt it last night. She died not long after I saw her," I went on. "But she went in peace. She asked me to tell you she's sorry." Helen sighed. Her breath trembled down the line. "Then now we just have to live," she said, without asking permission. We stayed quiet for a while, listening to each other breathe. For the first time, that silence between us didn't hurt. I hung up and put the phone away. The sky was darkening. A flock of birds crossed diagonally, black against orange. I thought of everything that had happened in just a few weeks, how something as tiny as a photo could dig up half a century of lies. I thought of Emily, of all the times we'd argued without knowing why, of the gaps she'd perhaps inherited too. I stood up slowly, envelope still in hand, and started walking home. My body felt lighter, not from relief, but because something inside had broken loose. Fear, shame, maybe the need for perfect answers. As I turned the corner, I understood not everything has to be neatly closed to make sense. Some truths are only useful if you walk with them, not if you tell them. At home, I found Emily asleep on the sofa. I put a blanket over her and watched her for a moment. Her face had a calm I hadn't seen since she was little. I leaned in, brushed a strand of hair off her forehead, and whispered something I don't know if she heard. "Now I know where I come from, but not who I have to be. That part's up to me." I sat down beside her, opened the window, and let the night air in, tangled with the city's murmur. On the table, the photo that started it all was still there, the phrase on the back barely legible. I picked it up, looked at it again, and smiled with the mix of exhaustion and gratitude that only comes when fear has worn itself out. Before putting it back on the table, I turned it over and, under those old words, added 3 more, small but final, with a pen. "You've found me now." And that night, for the first time in many years, I slept without jolting awake, certain that even though my life had been stolen twice, I had finally learned to live it in my own name. And that's where my story ends, or at least, the part I dared to tell. I don't know if you believe in coincidences or that everything happens for a reason, but that photo, that sentence on the back, changed my entire life. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to me, truly. Before we close this chapter, I'd love to know what you would have done in my place. Tell me in the comments. I want to read you. And if this story touched you, subscribe, because I still have many truths kept under lock and key.